The cold voice of the airline supervisor cut through the airport terminal like a knife. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't let you on this flight." The words felt like a slap. He stood there, gripping the folded American flag in his trembling hands, his breath heavy with disbelief. "Excuse me?" His voice was calm, but his eyes were stormy. "You heard me," the supervisor, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform, sneered. "This isn't your flight." The soldier's jaw clenched. The casket carrying his best friend's body was already loaded onto the plane. He had been tasked with escorting him home, an honor, a duty, a promise. And now, they were trying to stop him. He glanced at the other passengers in the terminal. Some looked away, others watched with curiosity, but no one stepped in. He knew exactly why this was happening. The look in the supervisor's eyes said it all. He didn't belong. Not here, not in first class, not on this plane. A deep anger simmered in his chest. He took a slow step forward, forcing himself to stay controlled. "I have orders," he said firmly, reaching into his pocket for the military documents proving his mission. The supervisor chuckled, shaking his head. "We don't need to see that." A security guard approached from behind, hand hovering over his radio. "You need to leave, sir." And that's when it happened. Something that would change everything. The soldier lifted his chin, refusing to move. "I am not leaving without my brother," he said, his voice unwavering. "And if you think you can stop me, then you've made a big mistake." The terminal fell silent. 4 hours earlier. Sergeant David Carter had barely slept in the last 48 hours. He had just landed in Dallas after a long flight from Afghanistan. The moment he stepped off the plane, he was already moving toward his next duty, escorting his fallen friend, Private First Class Jamal Thompson, back, home to Atlanta. Jamal wasn't just a fellow soldier. He was his best friend. They had trained together, fought together, survived together. Until one day, Jamal didn't. A roadside bomb had ripped through their convoy, and David had been the one to hold his friend's hand as he took his last breath. "I got you, man," David had whispered through gritted teeth, choking back his own tears. "I'll get you home." Now, standing in the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, David adjusted his uniform and exhaled. The folded flag in his hands felt heavier than it should have. His connection to Atlanta was tight, barely an hour to get through security and board. But he was prepared. He had his orders, his escort papers, and everything else squared away. This wasn't his first time flying under military orders, and usually the airline made things easy. But today, something felt off. As he approached the gate, he noticed the airline supervisor eyeing him. The man's lips were pressed together in a thin line, and his posture screamed annoyance. David handed over his ticket and military ID. The man barely glanced at them before shaking his head. "This seat's been changed." David frowned. "Changed?" "Yeah, you're no longer in first class." David clenched his teeth. "I was assigned that seat. It's part of the military protocol." "Well, it's been reassigned. You're in the back now." David stared at the man, feeling something twist in his gut. "Reassigned to who?" The supervisor didn't answer. Instead, he waved over another agent and whispered something. The woman nodded, glancing nervously at David before hurrying away. "Listen," David said, keeping his voice even. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier. His casket is on this flight. I need to be there when we land." The supervisor smirked. "Yeah, well, you'll still get there, just not in first class." David knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it before. The color of his skin, the uniform on his back, none of it mattered to this man. David took a breath. "Fine. Just get me on the plane." The supervisor's smirk deepened. "Actually, we're having issues with your reservation. You might not be flying at all." David felt his fists tighten. "What?" "We have the right to refuse service. You might want to step aside." "Step aside?" "Not happening." David squared his shoulders, his voice low and firm. "That casket is on your plane. I am on that plane. The supervisor crossed his arms. Not today, soldier. The tension in the air was thick. The security guard stepped closer. People were watching now, whispering. Some of them had their phones out, recording. And then, just as David was about to demand an explanation, a voice rang out across the terminal. Excuse me? What's the problem here? David turned and felt a rush of relief. It was a fellow soldier, an older man in full-dress uniform, a high-ranking officer. The supervisor hesitated, suddenly unsure. And that's when David realized he wasn't alone. But this battle wasn't over yet. The officer's presence changed everything. Under his stern gaze, the airline staff had no choice but to let David board the flight as planned. With a firm handshake, the officer reassured him. You're not alone in this, son. David took his seat beside the window, exhaling deeply. As the plane soared into the sky, he finally allowed himself a moment to grieve. He ran a hand over the folded flag resting on his lap and whispered, We're almost home, Jamal. When the plane landed in Atlanta, a military honor guard was waiting on the tarmac. As David stepped off, the weight on his heart lightened just a bit. The battle at the airport was over, but the fight for respect and justice would continue. Jamal had given everything for his country, and David had fulfilled his last promise, to bring his brother home with honor. As the casket was carried away with dignity, David stood tall, knowing that in the face of injustice he had not backed down. Some fights were worth it,